Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Supply Chain Information Flow. I'm your host, David Johnson. Gonna take a few minutes and wait for a couple of more people to join. Hopefully we can get to 60, 65, 75, a million. We can see how many people we can get to start talking about supplier performance. Hope everybody's having a wonderful day today. So far, so good. We're going to take advantage of the chat and Q&A. If you have any questions for myself, for Stephen Nichols, our esteemed guest today, make sure that you throw those questions in the chat or the Q&A, and we will absolutely try to get to any of the questions that you have. Again, on behalf of the Institute for Supply Management's New Jersey chapter, welcome to Supply Chain Information Flow. Today we have Mr. Stephen Nichols, the principal for Banyan Business Outcomes. Stephen, why don't you take a second and introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, David. Glad to be here. Appreciate the invitation to come and talk today and get interviewed, I guess. So this is great. But I'm Stephen Nichols. So my background is I spent many years on the sales side and account management side of the house, taking care of technology vendor relationships, with clients, I guess, from that perspective. And then left that half of my career about a year ago, and I started working on managing those kinds of relationships for the client side, right, and vendor management. So for me, when I was an account executive, what I understood or what I saw was that some of my relationships were extremely valuable, where I was doing really great strategic work for people and having a big impact. And in other cases, it was more transactional or less impactful and less useful. So I have spent a lot of time thinking about what the difference was between those two relationships and how to cultivate those true partnerships between a client and a vendor, and have come up with a body of knowledge and a tool set for doing that, and kind of focused on building those kinds of partnerships. So that's what I spend my 40, 50, 60 hours a week doing, and it's been quite fun over the last year or so.
Well, I think this is really timely. Considering, most of us here work in procurement or supply chain, we have to focus on dealing with and living with these longer term contracts, right? And in order to get the most value out of those contracts, we have to ensure that the supplier performs up to and above what those contracts are, right? We've got terms and conditions we've written. If you're lucky, you work in procurement and sourcing, you get the contract signed and you hand it off to somebody else to manage. But most situations, you end up back involved in this in some way, generally because the vendor is underperforming.
Right.
So in your experience, Stephen, why do good vendors underperform?
Well, I think there's a few answers to that question. Right. There's of course the general fumbling kinds of issues, right? Just vendors drop the ball, they have bad systems, they hire the wrong people, the processes are wrong, that kind of thing, of course. But those probably aren't good vendors, right, by definition of the question. I think also vendors tend to get a little bit too wide in some cases, and they'll end up making strategic issues with their business, and that leads to struggles in performance too. And that's something that I saw in particular in the IT industry, where companies would start offering everything under the sun and not do anything terribly well. But I think there's also some things that can be done during the contracting phase and the relationship phase that can create that performance problem. So one example of that is like a perverse incentive. It's where you memorialize into a contract some kind of incentive that actually runs counter to what's of business value to your company and what's in the best interest of the vendor. And there's a few examples of that. And there's actually a guy won a Nobel Prize a few years ago for working on that specific issue. I can talk through that too. Also, there's conflicts of interest, right? The account managers you work with might be focused on growing revenue more so than maintenance, or more so than making sure they're delivering against the obligations that they already have. if they're following a land and expand kind of approach, and that's not necessarily going to serve you or serve the vendor, frankly. So that might be a problem for it. And then I think also you mentioned contracts, and I think that contracts can be inflexible, and they can be misaligned with what's of value to the company, or the company's needs migrate, and the contract, of course, is something that's pretty static. And I think that can set up a vendor for failure and to struggle. So, I think there's good approaches around governance and things that you can do to prevent all those kinds of mistakes and make sure the vendor and you are developing a healthy relationship.
So how do we build flexibility into the contract? Oh, okay, maybe not flexibility into the contract, right? But you did mention the terms governance. And when I think governance, you think relationship, right? When you think relationship, you think partnership. If we're building out this relationship, we have to build it out so that there's it's a mutually beneficial partnership, right? And in a lot of ways, we don't think that way as procurement folks, because we want to get the most out of the deal. We want to win the negotiation. We want to win the contract. How can we, as clients, as sourcing people, work to be better partners, both in the contracting phase and after the contracting phase?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first step is, first of all, recognizing that it is a partnership. Well, and I should say this, for some of your vendors, it's a partnership, right? Like the person who comes and waters your plants, you probably don't need a partnership with that person, but someone who is like taking care of a core application or doing some kind of core business process outsourcing thing, like those are people who should be partners, and investing in those relationships pays off for your company and makes a whole lot of sense. So, I mean, first of all, like saying, well, this is a partnership, we're going to grow together. We're going to, I'm going to help you improve the way you deliver the business, and you're going to help me be more effective on my side. Like that's a critical kind of thing. And that's a personal relationship. It's usually person to person that happens. So that's the first step. But then I think, there's other ways that clients can kind of hamstring themselves and end up poisoning the relationship and causing problems. So like one example of this is forcing the vendors to chase these shiny objects that come up. I had a client that I worked with a few companies ago. It was a large organization. It was a Fortune 500 that everyone's heard of before. And they had, let's see, a new person take over like a director role in the business. And it was our new primary point of contact. So we were, trying to, impress them and kind of resell the deal and manage the relationship. Well, what happened was they were looking at what we were delivering, and just it kind of is a random shot across the bow, like, can you please send me the documentation on this one process? And so we sent what we had, and it wasn't up to her standards. So she corrected it, said, well, you need to improve this. And can you send me the documentation on the next thing? And then the next thing and the next thing. And before you knew it, we were sending all of our documentation on all of our processes over to her, and nothing was quite good enough. And we ended up spending a whole bunch of cycles and a whole bunch of time developing documentation for how we deliver the service. Now, of course, documentation is an important part of how you do any kind of managed service or any kind of business process outsourcing thing. It's critical for sure. But, was the client's need really served by investing all of this time into documentation? Probably not. Probably there were higher level objectives to it, but more important things to chase. But I think that what started off as just an exercise to keep the vendor on the toes became something that was a distraction for both her team and my team, and didn't help anybody else at all. So shiny objects can be something that can be avoided, certainly.
Do you think in that situation, the idea was to evolve the relationship from where it was to a place that got better business outcomes in her mind, and she was just not communicating it well?
No, I think that's right. I mean, I think she's trying to get better value for what she was spending with us, for sure, right? I mean, that was the objective of it. But a way that a partner, if that were a partnership conversation, the way that would happen was, during a quarterly business review or that kind of thing, you would look at the entire relationship and say, okay, well, in terms of documentation, we're at 2 out of 5 in terms of, delivering this service, we're a 4 out of 5 or a 1 out of 5 here, and like judging performance against the contract terms that way, that would provide a more holistic perspective. Instead, it was an ad hoc decision that this was a priority. So I think it was well-meaning on her side, but what it ended up being was a distraction and a poorly prioritized distraction. That was my feeling about that, I guess.
So
and I think sorry.
Oh no, go ahead. Go ahead.
It's also an example of leadership, right? Like as procurement professionals, you really have to have some kind of role of like leading from behind all your vendors and making sure they're delivering what they should be doing, because all of us are human beings, right? So in theory, you're just buying the contract and the SLAs, and this is the objective that you're getting. And if it's a robot, it's a robot. If it's a person, but the reality is all of us are human beings, and we're all working together, especially if it's a complex BPO relationship where two delivery teams are interfacing on a daily basis and developing those interpersonal relationships. So having some kind of leadership position and being able to help to develop the people on the other side of the table also serves the company well. Now, it is managed service for a reason, right? You want them to manage it. However, you do need to lean over a little bit and make sure they're being successful with it too.
Yeah. A question came in from Walter. It would be interesting to get an example of a situation where you include in a contract a reward to a supplier if it exceeds the expected performance. What type of reward is considered? Thanks.
Yeah, you bet. Like a gain share model. I'm a big fan.
That's exactly what I was thinking.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of that too. I prefer gain shares far more than penalties because I think they work more psychologically for people. But gain share is something that can be used to kind of inspire innovative ideas and thinking from your vendors, and to move somebody from being merely a performing vendor into a true partner. So a good example of that, I guess, would be coming to a vendor with a specific problem that you have, right, and then tasking them to solve this problem, and we're going to be able to kind of share the return from making that happen. So I had one situation where, I'm sorry, a lot of my examples are going to be IT related because that's kind of my focus, but we had one example where a client, we were doing tier 1 phone support for a client, and everyone knows that a large percentage of the calls that come in for tier 1 support are simple password resets or things that people could really do themselves. So there's this shift left initiative, right? You're trying to get people to take care of the issue themselves, or have a lower tier person take care of it before it gets escalated to a more expensive person. So in this case, we developed a self-service portal and a whole bunch of documentation, and perfected the documentation, and then did like a password reset tool and made a lot of effort. And what that does, of course, is it lowers the revenue for the vendor, right? The vendor is getting fewer calls, doing less work. So that's running counter to their, and their incentives in theory, right? But it absolutely helps everybody along the chain, because on the client side, the end users are getting their systems resolved or their issues resolved much more quickly than if they had to wait to talk to somebody from my company. So that was a great example where the client came to us and said, please help us reduce the number of calls that are coming in and get people back to work faster. You go through and you develop a portal, and then as a result of it, we were able to renegotiate the contract so that it was more profitable per call, and it also put us into a position to earn extra business down the road too. So I think that's an example, Walter, that could help her. It worked for me.
Yeah, gain share has broad applicability across industries. We did it with a contract manufacturer organization. Our contract with them was for production out of a single site, because that's where our logistics were located. So that was the contract. We had some supply chain problems, and they agreed to take it on at a different site, which ended up being lower cost. And instead of us just taking the savings, we gave it back to them in a gain share model as part of this particular SOW, so that they could make improvements to, other logistical areas that we wanted to take advantage of. So
Yeah.
we essentially fixed the problem by moving it to another production location and then saved ourselves some money, which allowed us to open up additional efficiencies. So the gain share model is very, very valuable. And it's
Yeah.
something that you should think about when you're starting or building any kind of a managed service or an outsourced arrangement or something like that.
Yeah, there's a Japanese term, I'm probably going to mispronounce it. It's a kiretsu, I think. I probably murdered that, but but the idea was, so there's a great Harvard Business Review article about specifically this, and in the article, some researchers interviewed executives at large parts manufacturers for the auto industry, and they had some just absolutely livid comments to be made about working with some of the American manufacturers, because they felt like if there was any kind of issue at all, they were the first people to be blamed, and the manufacturers would push them around and force them to lower the pricing. And it was a really bad relationship. And then they contrasted that with Toyota, right? The Japanese companies. So for Toyota, if a manufacturer were to miss a deadline, they would actually send an engineering team on site and kind of redesign processes and make sure the deadline wasn't missed a second time. And they would make that, and Toyota would make that investment into one of their suppliers to improve their performance, so that Toyota got a better return off of that. So they're clearly leaning over and exceeding the terms of the relationship by doing that. But the result was that the vendors were much more willing to work with Toyota, and that they had a much better experience with it. There was one example they had in the article that said that one of the parts manufacturers came to Toyota and said, we want to increase our production, so we think we're going to open up another factory here, and they kind of ran the idea past them. And they said that a couple of weeks later, Toyota came back to them and said, we don't think you need to open up another factory. Instead, let's just rearrange the way your machinery is so that you can push more product through the factory, and it'll save you $10 million, or whatever the number was. And they looked at it, and Toyota was right. They could absolutely do that. Now, that's clearly an example of somebody leaning over the relationship and taking care of the vendor's interests. But it's also a way of serving their own interests, right? And Toyota has great relationship with their suppliers because of that kind of overinvestment. So maybe that's another good example, I guess, of what partnership looks like.
So, I mean, you think about it, in my history, we meet suppliers all the time, and sometimes those suppliers aren't fit for purpose, right? Now, DE&I is a huge thing, right? Where everybody wants diverse suppliers, they want minority and women-owned businesses, but sometimes those minority and women-owned businesses are not scalable to the size of your organization. Have you been in situations where you've taken a supplier who may not have been fit for purpose and asked one of your larger suppliers to put them under your wing so we can make them better so that they can be one of our suppliers later?
I honestly have had mixed results with that, right? I think some companies are ready to be built up and scaled and have the kind of leadership you need to be able to perform at a higher level. And other companies are the size that they are because that's the quality of leadership or ownership that they have. And it's not a limitation of investment or resources. It's more of a personal limitation for people. So I'm thinking of there's a company I know that did managed services for AWS, for example, for a large client that I had, and they were doing excellent work for that. And the client pulled them over to start doing managed services around Azure, which is a separate cloud platform, of course, from Microsoft. And the result was that the company fell down and ended up delivering poor performance on both sides. And it kind of ruined the relationship to do that. So I think that you can, if you're tasking a vendor to solve a specific problem and it's within their core competency, I think that's a great way for that partnership to happen. But if you're asking someone to get too far out over their skis, well, you're going to have mixed results with doing that. That's my experience, but it sounds like you've had other experience with that.
I actually have. So I had a smaller managed service IT contingent labor provider. that really wanted to do business with them. They had a great business model. They had a great team. And I really wanted them to succeed, but they were not big enough for us. So I had a strategic relationship with a large multinational organization. And I said, hey, I want to work with these guys in this area. And you're going to win the RFP for this area.
Mm-hmm.
Can you subcontract with them?
Mm-hmm.
Because I want to build them into my pipeline of suppliers and help to grow them. And there'll be a second tier diverse spend for you and a second tier diverse spend for me.
Mm-hmm.
And fortunately, we worked it out well so that they became a supplier of note for us. They grew in leaps and bounds, and they learned a lot from the other supplier. That supplier ended up buying them wholesale and their entire team. But it was good. It was good for them for 6 months. This guy, 7 months, this guy who owned a smaller business got to feed off of a large organization,
Mm-hmm.
and he ended up cashing out and then started another company doing a completely different thing. So, it was a great experience for them to scale up, and it was a good experience for me because I got a whole bunch of really good resources that I would have had to miss out on because of the size of the organization.
Yeah,
So
sounds like you had
we're going down a rabbit hole now, and this is me just personally asking questions. It doesn't have anything to do with what we were talking about. So I want to try and bring us back to the topic before I start diving deeper into some of the cool things that Toyota does, because I know you know all about that stuff. So we've identified a bunch of problems that we create, either as in looking for contractual solving problems with the contract, or conflicts of interest, or business problems, or just errors that we've had. How do we overcome these identified problems? How do we fix the disconnect, the gap between delivery to contract to relationship to business value?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's really the focus of this, right? Like contracts, I think we were talking before, but contracts are kind of like ice sculptures. Is someone spends a lot of time meticulously building this ice sculpture, and then everyone admires it for a moment, and then as soon as you get into the heat of operations, it melts and becomes an irrelevancy. And what you end up seeing more often is operational teams manage these relationships in like an ad hoc or a political kind of way, or more so than what the contract terms were. I had another client for a big company that I worked with, where it was another turnover situation. Some new director came in and became my primary contact. And it was clear that the person had never managed a vendor like us before, and it had never, they were getting promoted for sure. Like this was a big job for them. So I was trying to work through this, and they asked and said, well, there's a managed service. I want you to do this. And I said, well, it's not actually in the contract. It's clearly, it's out of scope of the agreement. And he said something like, see, you guys can't even write contracts right.
Ooh.
Right. Which is kind of unfair. It's like talking to the architect of the house and saying, well, I would assume there'd be a fourth bathroom here. I mean, like, well, it wasn't in the plans, and it's not the guy's fault. So, but that's how things happen, right? Like quickly the relationships end up being managed in this political way, or I would assume that would be a sentence that is used very often, and that's not really taking care of anybody. And at the same time, businesses' needs change and vendors' capabilities change as well. So there has to be some kind of flexibility in the relationship, that you just simply can't have with a static contract that gets signed every 3 to 5 years. Right, there has to be some level, like an adapter, I guess, that attaches the relationship to the actual contract to create that kind of flexibility for it, so that you can have these great relationships. So that for me is a governance structure. It's some work that you do after the agreement is signed to make sure that the client is onboarded properly, so that you can have a growing relationship. So I think how to go through this. I mean, the one of the core pieces of it is going to be a vendor scorecard. So the problem with one of the problems with contracts is that they're written in this kind of overly erudite legalese, right? As if there's going to be an imminent lawsuit, and that's how lawyers always write these contracts. And it's not really usable, or it's not even readable really for any of the operational teams. In fact, there's always this joke like, well, it's good bedtime reading. That's always good for bed. And probably those terms are written and you know, within a year they're irrelevant. They're measuring the wrong thing that's no longer of value for it. So one thing you can do is take those contract terms and boil them down into, you know, specific clean phrases. Like this is exact, you know, section 2.1 is saying, you know, I need this kind of experience for my user, or this kind of experience for the company, or this delivery service, and have, you know, natural human language, English language, I guess, describing what's going to be delivered, and then track the vendor's performance over time against those terms. The trick is to use a little bit ambiguous language here so that you're actually going after the value and not the specific SLA. So if you're just, you know, replicating your KPIs that are written in the contract, that's less flexible than if you were to be a little bit more ambiguous about the kind of experience you're trying to create for your users. So in some vendors that might be appropriate, some vendors not. It kind of depends on the situation. So a vendor scorecard is a great way to track people's or vendors' performance against the contract, and also to create some of that flexibility. The other thing I'll mention is a relationship charter. Relationship charter is something that the two operational teams are going to develop together, where they talk about, you know, what are our shared objectives? How are we going to talk to each other? What is an emergency? What is not an emergency? What can you wake me up in the middle of the night for? What should you not wake me up for? And it's a way of, it's a non-contractual way for two organizations to figure out how they're going to work together and what's in bounds and what's out of bounds. And that has an extreme amount of flexibility, right? It's also a document that allows, you know, for turnover. Like if you have new people coming in, you can refer back to the relationship charter to explain exactly what's gone on and you know what's going on in a way that's much more relevant than some contract that was signed by a bunch of executives, you know, several months ago or several years ago, that kind of thing.
That's cool.
Yeah, a couple of ideas around governance.
So how often do you, we've got QBRs and we've got the relationship charter. How often is that relationship charter reviewed? And on a second question, to go back to QBRs, where's tactical versus operational versus strategic conversations happening?
You bet, right. So it depends on the relationship again, right? So if you have a big BPO kind of thing, you're paying a vendor $100,000, $500,000, $1 million a month, whatever it is, to take care of some critical function, then you're probably talking to the vendor on a daily basis, I would assume. You're probably going through tactical goals on a weekly basis, and, you know, going down some kind of Kanban charter, that kind of thing, right? It's best to have a separate conversation for more strategic matters. So a quarterly business review is typically going to be higher level. It's going to be, you know, it's going to involve different people are going to come to that. Executives might come down, like listen in on the relationship and provide some guidance for it and some feedback. But separating the tactical from the strategic is going to be a really important thing to do, so that you don't end up being muddied up with, you know, day-to-day ticket issues or that kind of thing. But I think I think you have to kind of gauge whatever's appropriate depending on how critical the vendor is and how large the spend is, and you know, how much maintenance that relationship really needs.
Do you recommend separating them by like categories? So for us in IT, is it like different cadence for software suppliers, different cadence for hardware suppliers, different cadence for services suppliers or managed services suppliers? And what do you suggest?
So quarterly for all strategic vendors, all vendors that have sufficient spend and are delivering services that are critical. There ought to be some kind of strategic conversation on a quarterly basis. You also want to leverage those QBRs as an opportunity for continuous improvement. So you're looking at performance against each contract term and saying, okay, what are you going to do next quarter that's going to improve our experience here, and have a higher level, more so than just, well, I'm going to take care of Joe's ticket over here, but more strategic, I guess, more in terms of investments, right? For hardware vendors and licensing vendors, if it's Adobe, I don't know that you really need to. I don't need to pick on Adobe, but it's just there's not
Pick
a lot
on them,
of,
it's fine.
yeah, right.
We love Adobe.
Yeah, well, sure, everyone loves Adobe, but are they really critical to the business, right? So that might not justify your time if you have that. And also you might say, vendors who are earlier in the process need more cadence as you're developing all that governance and that relationship and norming how the teams are going to work together. You probably need to have more conversations than later on when they're a little more stable, right? So I think a flexible system, but in general, at least a strategic conversation every quarter is going to take care of things.
Okay. So we have about 15-ish minutes left. We have a question, excuse me, we have a question that came in. What is the best method to get feedback from end users on supplier performance over a large organization that is decentralized?
Yeah,
it is usually tough to get customer feedback unless they urgently need an issue to get resolved.
Yeah, right. Like they only complain when there's a problem, of course, but I've seen Net Promoter Score be used really effectively.
Yeah.
If you're not familiar with that, it's basically a simple question: is how likely would you be to recommend this supplier, this interaction, or whatever it is, to a friend or colleague on a scale of 1 to 10? If you're like 5 to 7, then you're neutral. No, 6 and 7 and 8 is neutral. 9 and 10 is a promoter. Below that is a detractor, because most people use 7 as kind of a benchmark, not 5. And then you measure that performance over time, and there's some formulas to it. It's not so much as simply as an average, but you measure the performance over time to make sure that they're moving in the right direction. And that's what's great about it is it's one question, so people are more willing to answer one question. It also says, are you recommending it to a friend or a colleague, right? That's what you're asking is, would you put your reputation on the line to say this vendor is a good vendor, or this interaction was a good interaction? So the stakes are pretty high for saying yes or no, right? So I've seen that used pretty effectively, and that might be the best way to do it.
And in a lot of ways, you can use that as a KPI for your contract, right? So if you have a managed service and you say, if your Net Promoter Score goes, you're screwing up, how do you fix it? We have to fix it.
Right.
Exactly. Another question in the Q&A: ideally, who manages a contract? Procurement or sourcing areas will negotiate and sign an agreement based on operational needs, but on a daily basis, end users' operations will be managing the deliverables. How do you integrate that to get a fair assessment on the supplier performance?
Yeah, that's the governance is the missing gap there, right? The team that signs the deal isn't the team that maintains it, and that's the problem with a lot of these agreements. So sign the agreement and then go through a cycle developing that governance work, like developing a vendor scorecard, a relationship charter, that kind of thing, to make sure it gets launched properly. And I think procurement, or some function of procurement, needs to extend, a month or 2 or 3 into the agreement to make sure that the contract is being lived up to on both sides. And then it gets launched and the operational people take over for that. Usually there are cases where it's a very large BPO agreement, and I've seen like a specific vendor management office, which is kind of a hybrid function between procurement and IT. Like a VMO might take over that relationship and have people dedicated to it. Yeah, so that works as well, depending on the size of the relationship.
Yeah, I live in that world right now. My job is the head of supplier management. So my sourcing folks negotiate a contract, and then they go, here you go, fly.
Yeah, I looked at you and I thought, well, wait a minute. I'm saying the wrong thing here. Yeah.
James
Yeah.
said that he has some scorecards that he uses, and Tanya was looking for a name, but she found it. Okay.
Okay.
So let's look at ways that we can, types of systems that we as procurement folks can use to automate or simplify solving these problems, in your opinion.
Yeah, you bet. So I actually, a large part of my business at this point is helping procurement people work through RFPs or like sourcing vendors or sourcing software and that kind of thing. So I'm actually involved right now helping a company find a contract lifecycle management system. And my head is in that specific category or type of system more so than others, but this is what I'm working on all afternoon, actually. So what I would say, after doing some research on this, is that there's a whole lot of overlap between all of the systems you can use for this. There's vendor management systems or like strategic sourcing software, that kind of stuff. So Procoro and Fieldglass and Jaeger. There's third-party risk management or vendor risk management stuff. GRC is a part of that too. There's contract management systems and contract lifecycle management systems. And all three of those things, and probably some other stuff that doesn't quite fit in those categories, all of them overlap, right? The functionality is all right on top of each other. And there's no clear delineation between what things do. So you can start off thinking, I really need some kind of contract lifecycle management, and then find out that there actually is a risk management platform or system that would be a more effective way and more valuable. So I guess, instead of saying the specific system is the best way to manage the relationship, what I would say is start off with a very thorough needs analysis from like an architect's perspective. Like what does it actually need? What needs to happen, right? What's the business problem? What's the impact of that business problem? Let's look at it from all the different stakeholders' perspectives, from both the vendor's perspective, from your internal perspective, the executives down to the people working on this level, the procurement people. Everyone needs to look at it, right, and figure out what would be valuable to them in terms of functionality, in terms of access to data, and yada yada yada. There's a lot of thought that goes into this. And then once you have that list of objectives, I think it's important to contrast it with the monetary financial value of solving each of the problems or meeting all those functional requirements. And the reason you have to tie that to the money is that a lot of these software selection projects can get derailed by political kinds of things, right? Like the loudest voice wants this functionality. It's really not very useful, or it could be done with Excel or that kind of thing. So unless you can tie it to an actual dollar value that the company is going to save, or amount of risk that's going to be decreased, or whatever the metric is, then that you're going to have it kind of unmoored from reality and actual business value. So after you've done a needs analysis and then compared it to the financial objectives of the company, I think at that point, going out and starting to survey the market and understanding the capability of all the systems, and that's work that I'm actually doing for this other vendor right now, like that's where that becomes much more valuable, because then you're looking at systems to solve a specific problem, as opposed to looking at systems and then trying to find a problem that it could solve, which is a critical distinction.
Yeah.
So those systems seem to work pretty well. And I think there's some interesting things on the horizon too around vendor management systems. If you spend some time on those websites, what a lot of them are talking about are simply contractors, right? That's what they're going after. I'm talking to a lot of companies right now who are saying, we used to have just a few contractors that did specific things, but now there's this kind of gig economy thing that's happening. So I had one the other day telling me they had like literally over 1,000 contractors that were doing work for them. And the problem, of course, is that you end up with 1,000 different contracts with 1,000 different consultants doing 1,000 different things, and every different contract is coming up at a different time. And they all have different terms and payment structures, and it's just a complete mess.
Yeah.
So having, especially if you're moving toward a gig economy approach, having some kind of system and set of policies and function built around managing thousands of contracts, that's going to be pretty critical. for any company of any significant size, because it's not a humanly possible task to just take care of thousands of contracts like that.
Agreed.
Yeah.
What do you think about just really quickly, I know that a lot of us are dealing with like managed services type arrangements. How do you feel, one, the economy, and two, the Great Resignation are going to affect the services that we're consuming over the next year to 3 years?
Yeah, right. I'll put my economist hat on. I think we're going to have the Great Resignation is going to continue. That's my guess. I think it's going to be here to stay, because we have what's called stagflation, right, which is low economic growth with low unemployment at the same time. So what that means is that a company's ability to give raises is going to decrease. They're going to be giving 2% and 3% cost of living increases, and at the same time, you have inflation, so everyone's suffering under 8%, 7%, 6% inflation every year. So you're going to have to switch jobs in order to keep up with inflation. And this happened in the 80s, and it was a big problem back then. It was not pleasant to live through. The difference between what happened in the 80s and what's happening now is that we now have a great deal of visibility into all the jobs that are out there, because we have LinkedIn and all the job posting sites. So everyone knows what everyone else is making, and everyone knows what's available elsewhere. And we also just came away from a pandemic that required remote work. So I can now work for a company in New Jersey just as easy as someone in Denver. I don't care where my employer is. I work from home. I mean, I sleep 30 feet that way. So, so I think what that means is that there's going to be a lot of turnover for every position moving forward. So when you're negotiating contracts with vendors, like, that's one of the primary risks that you have to look at is, do you have a good relationship with your employees, and are they likely to jump ship? And they probably are going to. So what's your recruiting process going to look like? Or you're going to have the situation too where you have a contract that describes a client vendor relationship, and two people will be sitting across the table from each other, both of them being new hires, clients a new hire, vendors a new hire. Neither of them were there when the thing was signed. So you're reading the agreement together and figuring out what exactly do you do for me? I don't know. What do I do for you? Let's find out. That's going to happen more. So having that governance structure on top of the contract is just that much more important, because it documents the history. It documents how people actually work together, not just how the lawyers describe it. And I think that's going to be critical moving forward, especially in light of all the stagflation and turnover we're going to see. Yeah.
I think that's a great answer. Very futurist of you. I appreciate you you looking into your crystal ball to see what the next couple of years are going to look like for people like me. Thank you. We're almost at time. I want to thank Stephen from Banyan Business Outcomes. He didn't really do it, but he should have. Banyan, please describe what you do really quickly before we run out of time.
You bet. So I do a couple of things. So I have this body of knowledge and this tool set for coming in and helping clients develop great relationships with their vendors. So setting up all that governance and the vendor management structure to get the outcomes that you're looking for. And the second thing that I do that I'm heavily focused on is sourcing great vendors. So I've spent the last few months interviewing dozens of technology managed services partners, and I found a few that I really feel confident, and they've been able to demonstrate to me they can perform well. So I'm able to make introductions there and set up a competitive selection process that hopefully meets any kind of internal compliance kinds of things you might have. So I find great vendors, I introduce them to great clients, and then I set up all the governance you need to make sure you have a great relationship.
Stephen, please put your contact info in the chat. So this way, in the event that anyone is in the process of revising their technology vendor stack, or if they just need a great resource to talk through and help them build a vendor managed vendor management program, they can reach out to you. I think that, you know, I've worked with him in the past. He's got great skills and a great knowledge set. So absolutely reach out to him if you need some assistance. Yeah, thanks for joining, and we'll see you next month.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.